welcome back everybody to our fifth and final lecture in the lecture series. Thank you so much for coming out in this really bad storm. I'm sure some of you had to wade rivers to get here, but thank you for coming. So today I will be talking about the four corners of Aiken County. And we can go ahead and get the slideshow up there. A lot of you do a lot of things in Aiken, right? I don't know that very many of you get out into the county. And I took the opportunity to do that for you. So you're going to hear about a bit of history, a bit about what's there now, and a little bit of a travel log, because I'm hoping at the end of this, you want to go out into the county. Oh. So when you think of Aiken, you think of horses, right? You think of the winter colony homes, maybe South Boundary with the Oaks, Oakland Gardens, nice place to visit. All the churches we have and the beautiful downtown that we have, and those are all wonderful things. But Aiken County is a lot more than this. Think about it. The city of Aiken is 21 square miles. The county is over 1,000 square miles. Did you know that? The city has 30,000 people. The county has 170,000 people. The city was settled 186 years ago. The county was settled well over 300 years ago. So there is a lot to the county. Now, before there was a county, before there was even a railroad, we had Edgefield and Barnwell and Orangeburg making up this area. And what is going to become Aiken County only had two settlements. I circled them in yellow there on these 1825 maps. Not yet. Back. Okay. Hamburg, and it was still being called Fort Moore sometimes. It already has transitioned to being New Windsor. It's going to be Beach Island. But those are the only two real settlements. But the map wasn't empty. There were homesteads and small plantations everywhere. And I've circled just a few of those in green. And this is just part of those maps. There were hundreds, maybe thousands of these. There were also mills. Every creek, every river had grist mills and sawmills on it. And I've circled a few of those in blue. So there was already a lot in this area. We had cotton fields. Cotton was one of the major crops here. And we had a grist mill there, Yancey's Mill. This is built in 1845. It's in Aiken County, and it may be the only mill that's still existing in South Carolina. And you can see it right from the roadway. This photo is taken from the road, if you know what road to go on. But in fact, a railroad comes to the area. So this is a map from 1829. It's just the second survey that's being done to map out a route between Charleston and Hamburg. So you see Charleston here and Hamburg. And this route goes for the most part along a ridge right by the Edisto River before it's going to take a sharp jog at the top there to drop down into Hamburg. Here's a little close-up of that. It is in Aiken County now. So down here, you have White Ponds. Right there on the map. It wasn't really a settlement. McCreary Plantation was there. And it was the intersection of some roads between Edgefield and Barnwell and Hamburg, but there's not really a settlement there. There's Polecat Pond. It is just a pond, but it's on everybody's map because it's a waypoint for people to keep track of. There's the Mosley Place. Now, Mr. Mosley had a little store at a crossroads way back then. And the railroad surveyors commented on that store and would always say, yeah, the railroad's going to go by Mosley's. And then there's Captain Williams' place. The railroad was going to go near his plantation, which we all know is in Aiken. and then dropping down into the Horse Creek Valley. So there's a map of that original railroad, and there is outlined what Aiken County is now. This is a 1903 map. I wanted to use that because it's a good way to illustrate all the railroads in the end. But that first railroad line only had a few stops. They had to stop every 8 to 10 miles to take on more water and more fuel. So they'd have some kind of stop. They wouldn't build a town there necessarily, but there'd be some kind of little depot. Coming into Aiken County, you had White Pond, and then Windsor, the second one. The third one was Polecat, but by then people are starting to call it Johnson's or Johnson's Turnout, and then Aiken, and then dropping down into Hamburg. But there are going to be many more towns added along this railroad line over the next few years. A place called Oakwood that we never hear about anymore in Roseland, Graniteville, Warrenville, Langley, Bath, and Clearwater. And those 5 there at the bottom, they're all in the Horse Creek Valley. The Horse Creek Valley becomes very, very important to the development of Aiken County. Kind of circled it there on the map. You know, Horse Creek is in your backyard. You could drive there in 10 minutes. But most people in Aiken, they're taking Highway 1 or maybe the old Aiken-Augusta Road, you know, zipping over to Augusta. And no one gets off those roads and goes in to the old towns in Horse Creek. But we're going to do that today. So Horse Creek had its very first mill back in 1760. There was a guy who put a saw and grist mill there. But later, early 1800s, the French Huguenots start coming to the Horse Creek Valley, and they're developing farms. Now, it's not called anything at that time other than hard scrabble. That was their name for the valley because the soil was so poor for farming. But in 1830, one of them says, hey, you know, if we put a big mill here, a textile mill, that could be very productive in the Horse Creek Valley. And so he builds one, and he kind of fails, and then it burns down, and then he turns around and sells it to William Gregg in 1837. Now, William Gregg had no business with a textile mill. William Gregg is a jeweler, okay? He knows nothing about textile mills, but he had a vision. He thought that the South should start industrializing. The North's been doing it and making good money with it. And the South has been just producing crops and sending them up north. They should keep those crops, the cotton, down here and process it themselves. So he goes up north and studies the processes and everything, comes back down, starts running the Vaucluse mill. But more importantly, he builds the Graniteville mill, just 2 miles down from the Vaucluse mill. That's a picture from the 1800s of the Graniteville mill. It is the largest mill in the South. It is, for the time, state of the art, and it's going to make him a lot of money. There's William Gregg right there. Lovely guy. And here is what it looks like in that area now. This is that mill. You can see the Graniteville water tower. So he builds his mill, but he doesn't build it first. First, he puts in a canal to bring water and have power for his mill. And even before he builds the mill for the textiles, he builds a sawmill to make lumber. Why? Because he had another vision, and this was revolutionary for the time. He's going to make a whole town. He's going to need hundreds of workers. And he doesn't want them to figure out a place to live. He's going to do it for them. These are just some photos from the mill itself, and you can get a sense of how much labor might be needed. Look at this picture in the upper right-hand corner. Those machines go back and back and back. You have all the workers processing cloth over there, and hauling the bundles of hay, or hay, cotton. Okay, yeah, they didn't do a lot of hay there. And the workers need houses. He's one of the earliest people to come up with this idea of a mill village. This is going to be your all-inclusive resort. William Gregg is going to build houses for you, and he's going to rent those houses to you. You won't own them. He's going to own all of this land, this whole place called Graniteville. He'll own the houses and lease them to you. These are some of the houses. So those are photos from much earlier. Some of the houses were built out of granite, just like the plant itself was built out of granite. Still exists today. These are pictures I took last week. Some of the houses were built out of that lumber he made with the sawmill. And he had rows and rows of these houses in this neo-Gothic style. Here's a picture of one of them today. When he had 24 of those houses in a row, someone came up with the brilliant idea of painting them all blue to make it more attractive. And they called it the Blue Row. I'm not sure if I'd like 24 blue houses in a row, but you had all these houses, hundreds of houses in Graniteville, and he owns them all and leases them to you. This is his house. Very nice house, still very well kept up. It's right across from the mill so that he can watch everything unfolding. And so his mill managers can run across and tell him any news that he needs to hear. Now, you've got people, you've got a place for them to live, but he's going to do more than that. Remember, this is the all-inclusive town. Right off the bat, he builds 3 churches. You know, he's built that mill in 1845, and in 1846, there are 3 churches already. This is one of them, St. John's. Methodist, and very well cared for, still doing well today. Its claim to fame is that the legend is that it was a stop on the Underground Railway up to the north, where escaped slaves would pass through there. He had stores. These are actually stores from later mills, because he's done his mill. Now other people are going to build mills. There's the Langley Mill, the Bath Mill. And the mill towns would have a store. So you get paid, and then you could go spend money at the owner's store. This is sort of sounding like a scam, but people were very happy with this. Yeah, you're going to pay your rent to him. You're going to buy your goods from him. This is all good. You could walk to work. That's really nice. I mean, you never had to leave. But this was considered revolutionary. It was considered a good thing. And I know it was something that ends up being adopted by some of the mining towns out west. Back one. Schools. Now I want you to think, this is 1845. Going to school is not required. But William Gregg decides that education is really good for his future workers. So he puts in place compulsory education. Mill workers were required to send their kids to school up to the age of 12. They would go to school 9 months of the year. That was a big deal, because back then, if you did go to school, it was usually 3 or 4 months. He had them going to school from October till July. The kids would go to school from 8:30 till 4:30 every day with a 2-hour lunch. And in that 2-hour lunch, they could go home, make a hot meal to deliver to their parents at the mill. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fun. But this is the Graniteville Academy that he built for those children. And there's a really great photo that we've got of the students at the Graniteville Academy. Now, I said that kids went to school until the age of 12. There's a lot of anecdotal stuff out there that says that actually kids much younger than 12 were often working in the mill. But the theory was that You went to school to the age of 12, and if your kid didn't go to school, you were fined. And if they didn't go often enough, if they were truant often enough, you could be fired. So he's making it worth the parents' while to make sure their kids go to school. They had a little school bus. It was a wagon originally, and then they had this truck to go around, pick up the kids, and take them to their school. And here's the school now. It's not used as a school. It has other purposes, but it still exists today. And you can go see it. Now, you need recreation. Every mill town had its own baseball team, and they had a league to play. You had the Bath Mill, you had the Graniteville Mill, you had the Langley Mill. They all had their own baseball teams to play. And there was a band that Graniteville had. Their own band. Yeah, I mean, you need to have music too, right? This is your all-inclusive place. Now, life wasn't always perfect in the mill towns. First of all, you've got trains running right through the middle of the housing area. In the 1880s, there was a story, a little girl was on the other side of the tracks and her mom was worried a train's coming. So mom runs to get the little girl and it's mom who gets killed. There's a terrible derailment in 1886 when the big Charleston earthquake happens. Now, if you've been to Charleston, you know about the Charleston earthquake that was devastating there. It was felt in Aiken and caused the train tracks to buckle and derailments to happen. Then there was the 1995 accident where there was a mistiming on a coupling or on one of the switches, and a train hit a parked train. 17 cars derailed. A tank of chlorine gas was breached, and over 100,000 pounds of chlorine gas escaped. 9 people died, and the whole town was evacuated. It really was very devastating to Graniteville. And then finally at the top here, this is something you girls should have someone take you out there. This is a little grave at the Graniteville Cemetery that's way up on the hill. In 1855, train came through and there's a little boy on it, all by himself traveling, and he's very, very sick. They take him off the train to take care of him. His fever's so high, he can't give his name, can't tell where he was going, who his family was, and he dies. And the town gets a collection together and has a Christian burial for him up there. The marker just says, little boy, 1855. And to this day, people leave baby blankets and toys and things on that grave. This is a little quick on you may be fired, except that you are my ticket. But it's really nice to go up there. It's very peaceful up there to see. So really, I've told you a lot about Graniteville, but you have multiple towns there in the Horse Creek Valley, from Vaucluse, Graniteville, Langley, Bath, Clearwater. And if you get off those beaten roads, the main highways, you can drive around and see a lot of those things. Now, besides trains being a problem sometimes, the Depression was not good for the mill towns. The cotton prices tanked, the textile industry tanked, a lot of people were out of work. One of my sources says that the Horse Creek Valley was the second poorest area of the country, second only to Appalachia during the Depression. And we have some proof of that. So Monsignor George Lewis Smith was recently arrived to take over the St. Mary's Parish. And this is in the 1930s, he becomes aware of Horse Creek Valley, and he goes out there and he's stunned. These people are living in shacks that they insulate by stuffing paper in the cracks. They have no running water, no electricity. Their diet is so poor that hookworm and pellagra are rampant. And he's a guy who gets things done. So he contacts a convent up north and says, send down nuns. And he gets a hold of a bunch of winter colony people and says, give me money. And he starts providing food and services and medical care to the people in the Horse Creek Valley. He builds the Horse Creek Valley Welfare Center. And he makes it clear, this is not a Catholic thing. This is for anybody who needs it. That welfare center is still in operation today. So these are just some photos. He documented what was going on out in the valley. And these are just some photos there. One of his photos is heartbreaking. It's 4 children in rags. They've been sleeping on rags. And it's like, well, where are your parents? Oh, their parents had died. They're just living on their own in this shack. And these are young kids. So this map here just kind of shows the main mill areas that I already told you about. That includes Graniteville, Langley, and down at Bath. And here are just some random photos that I wanted to end this section with. There's the Bath Mill, photo of that. Over on the right-hand side here are a couple of photos from Langley. There's the old Langley Railroad Depot in the background there. It's used as their library now. There's a train out front. This is Langley Pond. If you've not been over to Langley Pond, wait until they finish the construction this summer. But they have a great 3-mile walking path there. And to call it a pond is like calling this a cottage. It's a lake. It was the Horse Creek was dammed up. They made a lake. It was big enough that the U.S. rowing team used it as their practice site for 5 years before the '96 Olympics. And the participants in those Olympics were welcome to come over and practice during those Atlanta Olympics. And they still do rowing out there. And then Burnett Town. Burnett Town doesn't have a mill. It was never owned by one of these mill owners. It's not a mill village, but it's got a cool story because it's the only one of these towns in the Horse Creek that's incorporated. It's not the biggest one. It never had a mill, but it's incorporated because, you heard about the trolley that ran from Aiken over to Augusta. We heard that in an earlier lecture. It started in 1902, and it ran through the Horse Creek Valley. And it wanted to pick up people along the way. And right about where Burnett Town ends up being, they need a stop to pick up people. And Mr. Burnett owns some land there, so they say it'll be Burnett Stop. And Mr. Burnett is really smart. He's like, if there's a stop here, I should start selling lots so people can have houses on the stop, right? Transportation, build them, they'll come. So he starts developing the area. And a lot of people have houses at Burnett's Stop. And it was like, okay. They have a lot of houses there and everything. And the trolley ends in 1929. The problem is all these people have become dependent on the trolley to get to work. There's no mill near them. And some enterprising guys get their cars and start a taxi service. Okay, people back then in Horse Creek don't have their own cars in general, so this taxi service is valuable. In the end, they have 50 taxis in the Horse Creek Valley, 50. And they're taking people to and from the mills for work, they're taking people into Aiken to go shopping, they're taking them over to Augusta. Turns out there's a law that if you have a fleet of taxis that's going to go to the highway, you must be based in an incorporated town. So Mr. Burnett says, fine, we'll incorporate. So Burnett Town is incorporated because of the taxis. Let's move down south to the southeast or southwest corner, where we have Beach Island and Jackson and Silver Bluff. So this is the oldest settled part of Aiken County. And in fact, some people say that Beach Island is the oldest inland settlement in the United States. I'm not sure what they're defining as inland, because I would have thought someplace up north, but they say it's the oldest inland settlement. The area was the intersection of several Indian trails, Native American trails. And you can see that over on the left-hand side. And so people had come inland, and traders and explorers, and they start settling by the Savannah River there to do trading with the Native Americans, start having a few small farms and everything. And this is in the 1700s. And they decide they need a fort there to guard against the West, because this is now the edge of civilization. So they establish a fort, Fort Moore. And Fort Moore is there. George Galfine has a trading post there, starts buying up a lot of land, starts a little plantation. This becomes a major area, the Beach Island area with Fort Moore. Well, eventually they don't need Fort Moore anymore because the western boundary has expanded, but it transitions to being New Windsor, and eventually the area is called Beach Island. But it's a very old area. And so because of that, we have some truly historic places there. I'm going to start with First Baptist Church of Beach Island, built in 1832. It's actually my favorite church there. It's not quite the oldest, but it's my favorite. It still looks beautiful today. We met with the pastor's dad, who took us all over the church. They've been refinishing it. And before the Civil War, it was a mixed church. You had blacks and whites there. We said, oh, that's really neat. And then we went inside. Inside, they still have their slave galleries. Now, I hope you know that almost every church in Aiken had slave galleries. St. Thaddeus, St. John's, the Baptist Church, they've gotten rid of them. But this church has kept them. So the slaves would come at the command of their masters and would sit up above, and the white people would sit down below. So I was asking him, so gosh, how did they even get upstairs? Oh, there's an answer to this. This is hard to see because it's now been whitewashed. Here's the front door of the church. Right above the front door is a hatch. And for Sunday services, the hatch would be lowered, a ladder would be lowered, and the slaves could go up the ladder through the hatch to their proper place in the slave galleries. It's quite the story. Then there's Silver Bluff Missionary Baptist Church, and it's probably the oldest church. It actually goes back to a congregation that was started in the 1700s. And they moved locations multiple times. This location came about in 1831. This church obviously is newer than that, but it was one of the oldest congregations. Let me see. I believe it was after the Civil War, it was the all Black congregation, and that was notable. Then there's All Saints Episcopal. It was built in 1836. It started as a Presbyterian church. And it was interesting because they boast about how they had Blacks and whites and Native Americans all attending at once before the Civil War. I haven't seen any documentation that those Blacks came willingly as freedmen, but of course, after the war, it wasn't that way anymore. And by the 1800s, Beach Island area has become the land of James Hammond. So he was a plantation owner. He actually owned 5 plantations at one time. He collected a couple of plantations when he married into a family that had plantations, and his new wife had brought plantations with her, Cathwood and one of the other ones. But he has these plantations, and they're working plantations. At one time, he controlled 22 square miles of land with his plantations and had over 300 slaves. But he decides in 1859 that he's going to build his main residence. And it's not going to be a working plantation. It'll be experimental. It's for recreation. and it's called Red Cliff. Have any of you been to the Red Cliff Plantation? Hopefully. It's just down the road, and it's now a state historic site with great tours by the rangers there. You really should go there. And it's a beautiful place. You can see a couple different angles here. It has the strangest stable I've ever seen. So it has all these stalls along the stable there. And of course, hay was stored up above. And every stall has its own chute to drop hay to the horse in that stall. It's pretty cool. But Mr. Hammond is not really so cool. James Hammond becomes governor in the 1840s and then becomes state senator in the 1850s. And I really can't emphasize this enough. This is what he said. I firmly believe that American slavery is not only not a sin, but especially commanded by God through Moses, approved through Christ. That was his view of slavery. That's one of the slave cabins still on the property. And part of the tour is a very big emphasis on the life of the slaves there at Red Cliff. Then, to make matters worse, when he's a senator, he gets up there in Congress and says, this is like 1859, you dare not make war on cotton. What happens in a couple of years? You're going to make war on cotton. But he said the North wouldn't dare do it. So that's how he encouraged all his cronies to just ignore the North at that point. But besides those things that make him a sleazeball, he's a much worse sleazeball. He molested 4 of Wade Hampton's nieces. The Wade Hampton II, the dad of that Wade Hampton, he molested 4 of his nieces while he was governor. And that was supposed to put an end to his career. You see, he's senator a few years later. He abused these slave women so badly. Now remember, abusing slave women is not uncommon back then, but he is so bad about it that his wife leaves him. So he is not a nice person. He dies before the end of the war. But you should go to Red Cliff and hear more of his story and hear about the slaves. And while you're down there, go down to the Silver Bluff Audubon Sanctuary. So one of the, George Galfine, the trader, had started Silver Bluff Plantation. Hammond had bought it later. But then a big chunk of it gets turned over to the state and made into a wildlife sanctuary. And it's beautiful there with boardwalks and trails and everything that you can go on. And you can see different habitats of the South. You can see the swamp. You can see the pinelands. And it's free and open to the public every day of the year except Christmas, I think. Now, I've talked a lot about Beach Island. These are all Beach Island things. I have to mention Jackson because Jackson is a town down there and people live there. But Jackson just never really develops a lot. You know, it never got the boost from the Savannah Riverside that Aiken did. It really doesn't, not a lot happens in Jackson, except for 3 things. Jackson, decades ago, was known for raising fighting cocks. Yeah, that was a real popular sport in the South. And one of those fighting cocks is adopted by USC when they're looking for a mascot. And today we have the gamecock. My son goes to USC, and I was really kind of sad to hear this story. Then we have Albert the Killer Lion. There was a gentleman in Jackson who had a lion back in the early part of the 20th century. And he rented the pair of them out to circuses to travel around, you know, do a lion show. Only the lion attacked and killed a man. And you might think that that would put an end to the whole lion show. And instead, he painted up the truck that he would haul the lion around, Albert the Man Killer, and he was even more popular on the circus circuit. And then finally today, the Carolina Dragway is down in Jackson, where they have drag racing down there. So that's all I can say about Jackson. Let's move on to another area. Let's go back to the middle of the state. Remember, I told you early on that some of the first stops along the rail, that very first rail line, were White Ponds and Windsor. And at the time it was Polecat, then Johnson's Turnout. Today, you know it as Montmorency. So those three towns, though, are what developed there. So you can see how the line would go on there. White Ponds there in Windsor, and Polecat, which starts as just a pond and becomes a train depot. But to be able to talk about those towns effectively, I have to talk about the Battle of Aiken. Thank you very much, Pete, for all the information you've been feeding me for the last couple of days. Because we know about the Battle of Aiken in Aiken. I mean, yeah, the battle happened in Aiken. We see a reenactment every year. But the battle started long before Aiken. You have Kilpatrick of the Union, who has been sent to terrorize the mills. We don't know if he was really going to burn them down or just pretend to go after them. But he starts in Barnwell, where he's issued all of those matches so that his troops can burn down Barnwell. He moves up to Blackville there, and has a skirmish there in Blackville. And then he's going to move up the rail line to Aiken. There was a substantial skirmish, more like a battle, at White Pond between the Union and the Confederacy. The Confederates have to drop back. They get through Windsor. They're tearing up track all along the way. They get to Montmorency, which is where he decides, Kilpatrick decides he's going to set up shop to be ready to go after Aiken. And he has his headquarters in Montmorency. And then finally, a couple of days later, only some of his troops, led by him, go to Aiken and have a battle. And they're defeated in 10 minutes. If you ever go out to the Battle of Aiken, they managed to turn this into a 2-hour event. It was like a 10-minute thing in Aiken. But okay, I will. But Kilpatrick turns tail and runs back to Montmorency. And the Confederates are chasing him the whole time. I guess that's the other hour and 50 minutes. So, but you need to understand, these towns were seriously affected during the Civil War. Aiken is not terribly affected, but the other towns are. So what happens is that in White Pond, there isn't really a lot in White Pond. There's McCurry's Plantation and a few little places, and they're kind of burned down. Windsor, there wasn't very much. Montmorency, there were a lot of homes, and most of them were burned down. And the tracks were torn up, and other rampaging and looting goes on. These are two homes at the top that were built after all of that happened, after the Civil War. And a church that was built immediately after that, the Baptist church there. So Johnson's Turnout had to rebuild itself after the war. And by the way, people are still calling it polecat. And do you know what a polecat is? A skunk. How would you like it if your town is being called by the name of skunk? So the people of Polecat, Johnson's, decide that they're going to officially change their name to Montmorency, which happens to be the name of an estate nearby that did survive the war. But by the early 1900s, they have rebuilt well enough that Montmorency is a very thriving community. You have stores, a blacksmith, an ice cream parlor, a casket manufacturer, doctor's office, a schoolhouse, the church, the jail. It's a very big community, much bigger than it is now. What happens over time, because They're doing well off of their plantations. They've got the train right there to deliver goods everywhere. They're growing a lot of asparagus, actually, and sending it up north. You get to the middle of the 20th century, and a lot of that agriculture drops off, and the town kind of drops off. And in fact, the railway is no longer stopping there as a passenger stop. So it kind of went downhill. But there are two places out there that you should know about. The Vale of Montmorency is out there. Back in 1840, this guy, James Achille de Caradeuc, he's of French lineage, but he was born in Charleston. He comes to the area and he wants to be a wine grower or winemaker and grow grapes to support that. And he finds this beautiful rolling land and he buys almost 800 acres. And he starts trying to grow grapes. And he grows apples really well and peaches really well. The grapes don't work out so well. So the whole winemaking thing doesn't really work. When it gets to the Civil War, Kilpatrick's troops come to his house. His daughter, Pauline, is there. And she is just furious. She wrote a diary, a very detailed diary about all this. This cruel war, the Yankees have come, give us your liquor, get your gold, get your silver. With axes, they broke down the doors and the trunks and the cabinets. And worst of all, of course, broke bottles of ketchup all over her dad's fine paintings. And also during the Civil War, 2 of Caradeuc's sons are killed in battle. So this isn't really working out for him at the Vale anymore. And so he packs up in 1869 and leaves. The house burns down a year later. But Henry Dibble comes to town and he goes out and finds the area of the Vale. He's come from Michigan. He needs to improve his health and he wants to have a nice farm. And this looks like a good place to have one. And so he buys this 800 acres and he builds this house. And this is a photo taken shortly after he built it in the 1880s. And it still looks just like that today. So Henry starts a dairy farm and he's a lawyer, okay? This is kind of strange. A lawyer is starting a dairy farm, but he seems to be pretty good at it because he becomes one of the largest dairies in the state. He has one of the first automated milking machines. He has the first silo in the state. Things are going well for him on the dairy end. Here are some more pictures of it, more modern pictures. That's the house today. Some of the outbuildings on the property. And the Vale, if you were in Montmorency, you've been through Montmorency at least, right? On your way someplace. It's probably just a mile off the road. And you can't really see the house from the road. But Mr. Dibble is not going to stop there. He has his farm and it's going really well, but he decides that he's going to put that lawyer talent to good use and he becomes the president of the Bank of Aiken, which becomes the Bank of Western Carolina. So he's the president of that. He becomes the president of the Carolina Power Company, and he's a big fixture in Aiken, doing a lot of work in Aiken, a lot of charitable work, but he kind of ruins it in the end because he later in life decides he must join and become a very active participant in the Democratic Party of the time because he needs to promote white supremacy. Yeah, so he's been this really great guy and then he kind of goes to that. But the Vale is still out there today. It's in private hands. And then we'll talk about Pascalinna. Pascalinna you can see from the road. It's on the south side of the road, just after you go through the main part of Montmorency. I actually went on their property and took this picture here. So they were off having their grandchild. So Pascalinna was built by Elizabeth Pascalis. it was developed by her, not built, because Cyril Pascalis was one of the engineers on that first railroad coming through Aiken. And he and his buddy, Alfred Dexter, decide that the railroad, this is going to become a big place. And so they buy 800 acres on either side of the railroad in Polecat. They do that in 1834. The next year, Cyril's mom, Elizabeth, moves down from New York and she buys the property from them. She's brought her grandchildren, because her daughter had passed away. So she's got her grandchildren with her. And she and the grandchildren and son Cyril are going to live there. There was a house on the property already, an 1820 house, and they moved it and turned it around to face the railroad, but that's the house that's there today. It's been remodeled a bit and everything, but it's still basically the same house. We have a model of the house upstairs here at the museum. So if you haven't been to our Pascaline room, you should go see that. So they live at this place. Cyril actually dies a couple years later, but Elizabeth and the grandkids live there and the Civil War comes. Thankfully, in a way, Elizabeth dies in 1864. She's lived a good long life. She left the home to her granddaughter, Theodosia, and Theodosia's husband. So they are there when Kilpatrick comes through. And Kilpatrick comes to the place and thinks, great, this is my headquarters. That house looks nice for a headquarters, right? So it's going to be his headquarters. But first, of course, his troops need to loot it. Now, Theodosia, what? What's so funny? I mean, it's like a given. You're going to loot the houses. If you're not going to burn them down, you have to loot them. That's what Kilpatrick did. Theodosia is 6 months pregnant when he arrives. Before he gets there, they, of course, have gotten word that he's coming down the road. She gets the 13 feather beds, which are highly prized, and takes them out to the property where some old trees had fallen over, and she buries them under the roots. You know how the root balls pull up and there's space there? Those 13 feather beds are put there. Takes all the hams and the silver, puts them in the corn crib, takes her wedding ring, wraps it in a handkerchief, buries it under a tree. The troops come. They find the feather beds. They take them up on the roof of the house, rip them open, and scatter feathers everywhere, chortling about the feather blizzard. They find the ham and silver. They burn down the silver. They take the ham for themselves. They never do find a ring, but neither does she until someone else finds it 13 years later. And then they start ransacking the house proper. And it wasn't until they find her grandfather's Masonic apron, which Kilpatrick was a Mason, that they decide they need to quit looting. But they've pretty much destroyed everything by then. So they use the house as a headquarters for a few days, go through the Battle of Aiken, are beaten back by the Confederates, stay in Montmorency for a day, and then they leave. After they have left, Theodosia goes out to the corn cribs. They've taken all the corn and scattered it. She's scraping corn off the ground, washing it, grinding it, and making bread for all the neighbors who had come and stayed at her house because their houses were all being burned. So kind of a really good story for Pascaline there. Now, Montmorency, I said, didn't really stay vibrant for long after the middle of the 20th century. You can see the train tracks out there. They're not really being used a lot. This is right in the middle of Montmorency. It's worse out in Windsor. It never really did develop very well. The population kind of just, I don't even know why it jumped up from 55 to 124 in one period, because then nothing ever happened. In Windsor, the only good building they had was their Baptist church, and they decided to tear it down and put up a new place and just save the bell there. And then White Pond. White Pond was never a big community, but it does have an interesting history story. And you should go out there and see this. So when the Savannah River site was being developed, the government brought in the Corps of Engineers because there were hundreds of cemeteries out on the site they want to take over. And they're documenting all those cemeteries, and they're trying to contact people like descendants to see where we should move the graves to. And in the end, they had 33 small African-American cemeteries with over 1,000 graves that nobody has claimed. So they buy up some land in White Pond and they move all the graves there. Thing is, they didn't arrange for any upkeep after that. This is in the early 50s. It's been 70 years since then. Trees have grown up. This is out there at the cemetery. There are 1,000 of these stones and plaques out there, buried in the woods. These were the ones I could get to. Some of them are covered up a lot more. All of them have a little tin plaque by them. So there might not be a gravestone really, but there's a tin plaque at every burial site. And it had information on who this was and where this burial came from. It was written on paper. It's washed out. And there was an article in the Augusta Chronicle I learned last year. One of the descendants of someone who's buried there, he asked the government, where are the records? Because I want to find my ancestor's grave. The records were kept, very detailed records, where it came from, exactly where they went, where each one was buried. They were given to another agency, and so far it appears that that agency may have accidentally destroyed them. But there's a movement going on to try and go out and clean up this graveyard and recognize it. I can't leave you on such a sad story. So you should go out to Montmorency. You can go to Pascalinna. The Pascalis Farms that's operated out there now is open Wednesday and Saturday, and they do herbs and vegetables and flowers. And right now they're open Wednesdays and Saturdays, and they run it out of this really charming, it's not a shack, it's really cute little building there. You can go out to Katydid Farms and watch carriage racing. If you want to see something that looks as scary as Roman chariot racing, go out there. And you can go to Aiken State Natural Area, where they have miles and miles of boardwalks, or they have canoes you can rent, so you can float down the Edisto River on the Blackwater with snakes hanging over your canoe. I'm not exaggerating. When I've done it, I was told, you would go under these low-hanging branches, and I'd go to hang on to them. They'd say, oh, don't do that. There are snakes up there. So there's a lot to do out there, but go to Montmorency. It's a really pretty area out there. How am I doing on my time? Oh my gosh. Okay, so Wagner and Sally. I'm going to have to go fast, unfortunately. I didn't realize I was going so slow. Wagner and Sally are the eastern corner there of the state. They had a rail line come in there. Wagner is the best place to go, honestly. Wagner started as Pindertown, and it was run, and a whole bunch of Gunters settled there. And this is Mr. Gunter, one of the Mr. Gunters, with his store, and they raised peanuts in the area. Peanuts are Pinders, so it's called Pindertown, or it's called Guntersville. And when the train came through, they lobbied to get the name changed to Wagner, because Wagner was one of the key people in bringing the train through there. There's the original train depot in Wagner. It's not there anymore. And here's another side of that depot. It's a very large depot. You heard from Dr. Curry about turpentine and how turpentine was manufactured in the area. That was one of their big commodities. Here's a turpentine still out at Wagner. And another one of the Gunter's stores and the first schoolhouse there. Most of the downtown of Wagner burned down in 1906 from a fire, destroyed the downtown, and it's been rebuilt in brick. but it's well worth going there. Wagner has one of the best small museums I've ever been in. It's a really, really good museum. It's right there in Wagner. And to fuel you on your trip there, we have the Little Bake Shop. They have a great cafe there. They've got the best donuts and fritters there. So you can go out to Wagner, go to the museum, and go to the bake shop. Sally, not as much to see right now. Their museum has been shut down. It developed with logs being floated down the Edisto. And it was the site of a Revolutionary War battle, the Battle of Johntown. Sally used to be called Johntown because it was settled by John Corbett, John Sally Sr., and John Sally Jr. So, or maybe it was John Corbett Sr. and John Corbett Jr. Anyway, 3 Johns. And so they called it Johntown for years until that became confusing to people and they changed the name to Sally. Sally was in the path of Sherman's march to Columbia, so a lot of it was burned down, most of the main houses. They quickly rebuilt after the war. The house on this house here, the Henrik Sally house, is the oldest. It's 1867, rebuilt right after the war. But scattered throughout Sally are about 60 other houses. There's the Sally Rail Depot up there at the top. Down below, it's now the town hall. And here's the old Sally School just built after the war. And here are some of those 50 to 60 houses that are in the Sally area. They aren't as well taken care of as you might be used to. You know, you go and see the winter colony homes, but there's a lot of classic architecture there. They were Victorian and Art Deco. And if you go around the town of Sally, you can see that. And Sally, of course, is known for the Chitlin Strut. And if you've got kids or grandkids, Eudora Farms is out there with their drive-through and now walk-through facility. And we're going to go up to a last corner for North Augusta. This corner has Eureka and Monetta. Monetta actually straddles the Aiken County, Saluda County line. Eureka was on a rail line. Nothing much ever developed there, but it's got one notable thing. There's almost nothing in Eureka now, except for this house, the Marie Comer Siegler house. She was one of the founders of 4-H. Back in 1910, she decided that the girls should have a tomato canning club, teach them how to raise garden goods and can them. And between 1910 and 1913, it grew to 20,000 girls were involved in that. She got invited to Washington, D.C. to advise the USDA on how to make this a nationwide thing. And she ends up being recognized by Eisenhower for her efforts. And that all led to the 4-H clubs. Monetta is all farmland. There is no really defined downtown at Monetta. Monetta has peach orchards and pecan orchards and strawberry fields. And this is all very good because you do still want to go to Monetta. There's their old railway station, long gone. A plaque there acknowledges that. But it was a main stop for a while because it was almost exactly halfway between Columbia and Augusta on Highway 1. So they had an inn there that people could stop over. And Watsonia Farms was out there. This makes Monetta worth going to. Watsonia Farms was founded in 1918 by Joseph Watson, and they were doing peaches up on the ridge there, but he starts asparagus, and he gets a bunch of the other growers to start asparagus. And they formed the Monetta Asparagus Growers Association. And pretty soon, Monetta is known as the asparagus capital of the world. It keeps that title for 20 years. It was also called, it led to the term South Carolina being called the iodine state. Still not sure I understand that. But out at Watsonia Farms, they have a place where you can buy peaches now. Wait till July 1st. They tell me that the good peaches will be harvested starting July 1st. They've got a place with breakfast. My husband and I went there. He said it's the best breakfast he's had in years. Their bacon, their hash browns, so good. And they sell their peach jam and everything there. And they sell homemade peach and strawberry ice cream. In the summer, the lines are out the door to get that ice cream. So you've got to go to Watsonia. And while you're there, slip across the county line to Ridge Spring and go to Cone's Meat Market, that Lauren introduced me to, for their sausage. It's amazing. And the Big Mo is out in Monetta. You know, we've got a drive-in theater. That's there in Monetta. So Monetta is a really cool place to go. It's a really pretty drive out there through the farmland. And I've neglected North Augusta, but hopefully you've been to North Augusta. It's the second biggest town in Aiken County, and there is a lot there. You already heard that Jackson started it as a resort to rival Aiken, hunting lodge, big hotel. Today, it has things like Brick Pond Park, that great place to go for wildlife, the Living History Museum with the colonial times reenactments, and the Arts and Heritage Center. So I had to race through the end. I talked too much in the beginning. But my goal was to inspire you to go out and explore our county, because there is a lot out there. And take that little turn off to the side road. Don't stay on the highways. The highways will kill your sense of adventure. You will go down a little road, go down a little dirt road. The dirt roads are even better. And you will find odd little places. And even when I went out to find that cemetery that's buried in the woods, I never felt unsafe or anything, other than there might be spiders and snakes. But I met so many great people out talking to them as I traveled around. So I want you to do it too. That's it. Anyone have any questions? Yes. You didn't take notes. So, well, there isn't. However, and I was actually going to have this ready for today, and I didn't. I've got a one-page sheet with the names of all these places and the address. And if we can get a piece of paper, if anyone wants to give me their email address, I will send that to you. So you can go out and see these places. Poor Mr. Yance is going to have all these people finding his mill.
Thank you all so much for coming out to our lecture series this year. It was a really great time, and please say thank you to Linda. She arranged all of it.